On a cold November morning in 1944, near the German-Dutch frontier close to Geilenkirchen, an artillery officer named Klaus Weber positioned himself beside his unit's howitzer. The weapon was a 10.5 centimeter light field howitzer, the workhorse of German divisional artillery. His battery belonged to the 344th Volksgrenadier Division and had received orders to provide fire support for a counteroffensive against American forces that had penetrated German territory during their Operation Clipper. Weber's service dated back to 1941. He had seen extensive action across the Eastern Front, where German artillery units had maintained dominance over Soviet gun crews through better optical equipment, superior coordination systems, and teams drilled in the art of shooting and moving. The mathematics of survival on that front had been clear and predictable. Soviet return fire was dangerous but slow. The response times allowed German teams to fire their missions, relocate, and live to fight another day. The Americans presented an entirely different challenge. Weber had absorbed the accounts filtering back from Normandy, from the nightmare of the hedgerow country around Mortain. The Americans deployed artillery in quantities that seemed to defy logic. Every infantry company had its own forward observer ready to summon fire that arrived with shocking velocity. The Germans had coined a phrase for this capability: fire magic. The Americans could concentrate the firepower of numerous batteries onto a single point within minutes of receiving a fire request. But missions were missions. The battery had to fire. Weber's crew loaded the high explosive projectile into the breech. The gun captain verified the weapon's alignment, double-checking the elevation and directional settings. The battery commander stood ready with his field telephone, then raised his arm in signal. 4 howitzers fired in rapid succession, their concussive reports rolling across the German defensive positions. The shells traced arcs through the air toward American lines 3 kilometers distant. Weber glanced at his timepiece. The second hand began its relentless sweep. His crew was already in motion. Trained hands executed the practiced choreography of preparing the gun for movement. German military doctrine had drilled this into every artillery crew from their earliest training days. The fundamental principle was simple yet essential: fire and displace. Never shoot from identical positions twice if avoidable. Never grant the enemy sufficient time to calculate your location and strike back. But Weber recognized that doctrine developed against Soviet artillery might prove insufficient against the Americans. He had heard specific accounts that chilled him. A battery near Saint-Lô had fired a mission and been obliterated before they could move. Another battery at Mortain had fired twice from the same spot, confident in their concealment. American return fire had arrived within 4 minutes, catching half the guns still in place. The survivors reported that American shells arrived in concentrated barrages, not scattered impacts, but massed salvos that saturated entire firing positions. The German military's confidence in its artillery had been constructed over 2 decades of development and 6 years of warfare. When Hitler assumed power in 1933, the German armed forces began secretly rearming despite the Treaty of Versailles prohibitions. Artillery development received priority attention. The Reichswehr had maintained clandestine training programs in the Soviet Union during the 1920s, preserving artillery expertise that would inform the designs for the coming war. The light field howitzer model 18 entered service in 1935. It represented a conventional but effective design, capable of hurling a 14.7 kilogram high explosive shell to a maximum distance of 10,600 meters. The weapon weighed nearly 2,000 kilograms in firing configuration and could be towed by half-track or heavy truck. A proficient crew could maintain a firing rate of 4 to 6 projectiles per minute. This howitzer had served throughout the entire conflict. It had supported the Lightning War through Poland and France. It had fired countless thousands of rounds across the Eastern Front. By 1944, it remained the standard divisional artillery piece, equipping the light batteries of virtually every German division. German industry had manufactured over 7,000 of these howitzers, and they were considered reliable, accurate, and effective within their design parameters. German artillery doctrine emphasized decentralized command and swift displacement. Battery commanders received training in selecting firing positions with multiple escape routes. Guns were positioned to permit quick attachment to towing vehicles and rapid departure. Forward observers were trained to request fire missions efficiently and to relocate, frequently to avoid enemy return fire. The system had functioned admirably against opponents whose artillery was less mobile or whose counter-battery capabilities were limited. Across Russia, German artillery had frequently dominated through superior fire coordination and crew training. Soviet artillery was numerous but often poorly synchronized. Soviet counter-battery fire could be intense, but was typically slow to arrive and inaccurate. German crews learned they had time after firing, frequently 10 to 15 minutes, to displace before Soviet return fire arrived. This created a tactical rhythm that German gunners understood. Fire your mission, immediately begin displacement procedures, be moving within 5 to 7 minutes. Reach a new position or protective cover within 10 to 12 minutes. The underlying assumption shaping German artillery tactics was that counter-battery fire required time. Time for enemy observers to detect the gun flashes or firing sounds. Time to calculate the position. Time to relay firing coordinates to friendly artillery. Time for those guns to receive the mission, aim their weapons, load ammunition, and fire. Time for the shells to travel to the target. German doctrine assumed this entire process would consume at least 10 minutes, usually longer. That assumption rested on experience fighting enemies whose artillery systems operated under similar constraints to Germany's own. Soviet artillery batteries received fire missions through telephone lines frequently severed by German raiding parties. Soviet forward observers often lacked the training or equipment to rapidly calculate accurate firing data. Soviet guns, while numerous, were dispersed and required time to mass fires on a single target. The German system had been built for the war. Germany had been fighting since 1939. It was not built for the war Germany was fighting in November of 1944. Weber's watch showed 90 seconds since his battery had fired. The guns were disconnected from their ground mounts, trails lifted, ready to be attached to the prime movers. The half-track transport vehicles that towed the howitzers were positioned with engines running. The crews moved with practiced efficiency, every man knowing his specific role. In another 60 seconds they would be moving. In 3 minutes total, they would be clear of the firing position. It should have been adequate time against any artillery system the German military had encountered in 5 years of war. It would have been adequate time, but the weapons now targeting Weber's battery were unlike anything the German military had previously faced. The United States Army had begun the conflict with an artillery establishment that on paper appeared unremarkable. The standard divisional artillery piece was the M2A1 105mm howitzer, a design dating to 1941. But what differentiated American artillery was not the individual guns, it was the system within which those guns operated. American artillery doctrine in World War II was constructed on 3 core principles that, when combined, created capabilities no other military possessed. The first principle was massed fires. American doctrine called for concentrating the fire of multiple batteries, even multiple battalions, on single targets. A fire request from a forward observer could bring down shells not just from the observer's own battalion, but from every artillery unit within range. This required communication systems and fire direction centers capable of coordinating dozens of guns simultaneously. The second principle was velocity of response. American artillery emphasized rapid reaction to fire missions. From the moment a forward observer requested fire to the moment shells landed on target, American doctrine aimed for times measured in minutes, not tens of minutes. This required training, equipment, and communications that prioritized speed at every stage of the process. The third principle was abundance. The United States industrial base could manufacture artillery pieces, shells, and support equipment in quantities that seemed limitless to armies that had fought under conditions of scarcity. American divisions were authorized more artillery than German divisions. American artillery units never faced shell shortages. American forward observers could request fire missions without concern for ammunition conservation. These 3 principles created an artillery system greater than the sum of its individual components. A single American 105mm howitzer was not dramatically superior to a German light field howitzer, but an American artillery battalion operating within the American system could deliver fire support that no German unit could match. The M101 howitzer, which had replaced the M2A1 by 1944, embodied the American approach. The weapon weighed 2,259 kilograms in firing position, slightly heavier than the German equivalent. It fired a 14.97 kilogram high-explosive shell, nearly identical to the German projectile weight. Its maximum range was 11,430 meters, somewhat better than the German gun, but not dramatically so. The technical specifications mattered less than what surrounded them. Each howitzer was part of a system designed for industrial warfare. The gun came with a fire direction center equipped with plotting boards, firing tables, and communications equipment. Forward observers carried radios that could reach battalion fire direction centers directly. Those fire direction centers could calculate firing data and transmit it to gun crews within seconds. The weapon could be brought into action quickly. The split trail design allowed crews to drop the trails, level the weapon, and prepare to fire in under 2 minutes. The breech mechanism was simple and reliable. Loading and firing could be accomplished rapidly by a trained crew. The weapon could sustain a firing rate of 4 rounds per minute for extended periods, with bursts of up to 10 rounds per minute possible for short durations. But the real advantage was not in the gun itself. It was in how many of these guns the Americans could bring to bear. A standard American infantry division in 1944 included 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers with 12 guns per battalion. That was 36 howitzers organic to the division. An armoured division had 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers in self-propelled mounts, another 36 guns. Corps artillery added additional battalions that could be attached to divisions as needed. The industrial capacity that manufactured these weapons was unlike anything the German military had encountered. The Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois began production of the M101 in 1941. By 1945, American factories had produced over 10,460 of these howitzers. This was in addition to the 4,133 M2A1 howitzers produced earlier in the war. American industry delivered over 14,000 divisional artillery pieces during the war years. Production was distributed across multiple facilities. Rock Island Arsenal was the primary manufacturer, but other factories contributed components. The Timken Roller Bearing Company in Ohio produced the gun's carriage. The Crane Company in Illinois manufactured the recoil mechanism. Dozens of subcontractors provided smaller components. The entire industrial base was mobilized to ensure artillery production never slowed. Ammunition production dwarfed even the impressive numbers for the guns themselves. The United States produced over 258 million rounds of artillery ammunition during World War II across all calibers. For the 105mm howitzer specifically, production exceeded 60 million rounds. This was approximately 4,200 rounds for every howitzer produced. German production, by contrast, was constrained by resource shortages, industrial damage from Allied bombing, and competing priorities. Germany produced approximately 7,000 light field howitzers during the entire war from 1935 to 1945. Ammunition production was limited by shortages of brass for cartridge cases and explosives for propellant and bursting charges. By 1944, German artillery units were frequently operating under ammunition restrictions, with batteries limited to a specified number of rounds per day. The disparity in production meant that American artillery crews could fire missions that would have been unthinkable in the German military. A single American battery could fire 100 rounds in a fire mission without anyone questioning the expenditure. German batteries carefully rationed their ammunition, knowing that resupply was uncertain. But production numbers alone did not explain why American counter-battery fire was so devastatingly fast. The speed came from the system that surrounded the guns, a system built on communications, training, and doctrine that prioritized rapid response. American artillery forward observers were assigned to every infantry company and sometimes to individual platoons. These observers were artillery officers or trained enlisted men who accompanied the infantry into combat. They carried radio sets that provided direct communication to their battalion fire direction center. The radio equipment was reliable and had sufficient range to maintain contact even during mobile operations. When a forward observer identified a target worthy of artillery fire, he followed a standardized procedure. He would call his fire direction center, identify himself, and describe the target. The description included the type of target, its location relative to known landmarks or using map coordinates, and the urgency of the mission. The fire direction center, located at battalion headquarters, received the call and immediately began processing the mission. Officers and enlisted specialists worked at plotting boards, large tables with maps mounted on them. They plotted the target location, calculated the range and azimuth from each battery to the target, and determined the correct propellant charge and elevation for each gun. This calculation, which might have taken tens of minutes using older methods, was accomplished in under 60 seconds by trained Fire Direction Center personnel using standardized procedures and pre-calculated firing tables. The center transmitted firing data to each battery by radio or field telephone. The battery received the data and immediately began preparing to fire. The executive officer in charge of the firing battery ensured each gun crew received the data. Gun crews set their sights to the specified deflection and elevation. Loaders prepared the correct ammunition. From the moment the forward observer made his initial call to the moment the first ranging round left the gun, as little as 2 minutes could elapse in a well-trained American artillery battalion. The ranging round allowed the forward observer to adjust fire. He would watch where the shell landed, estimate the correction needed, and call back to the Fire Direction Center with adjustments. The Fire Direction Center would transmit corrected data. The battery would fire again. Usually within 3 or 4 ranging rounds, the fire was on target. Once on target, the forward observer would signal for maximum fire. This was the signal for all guns to engage at full capacity. The Fire Direction Center would order all batteries within range to fire. A battalion of 3 batteries, 12 guns total, would fire simultaneous volleys. Each gun crew would load and fire as fast as possible, usually achieving 4 rounds per minute sustained rate. In a typical maximum fire mission, each gun might fire 6 to 10 rounds. The entire process from initial call for fire to shells impacting the target could be completed in 3 to 5 minutes for an experienced American artillery battalion. This was not theoretical. This was the standard American forward observers and fire direction centers achieved routinely in combat throughout the European theater in 1944 and 45. Counter-battery fire. The mission of destroying enemy artillery received priority in American doctrine. When forward observers, aerial observers, or sound and flash ranging units detected enemy artillery firing, they immediately called fire missions. These missions were processed with maximum speed and assigned to multiple battalions simultaneously. The goal was to get steel on target before the enemy battery could displace sound and flash. Ranging deserved particular attention because they represented technological advantages the Germans had not anticipated. American sound ranging units used arrays of microphones positioned at known locations across the battlefield. When enemy guns fired, the sound reached each microphone at slightly different times. By analyzing these time differences, trained specialists could calculate the location of the enemy guns with remarkable accuracy, usually within 50 to 100 meters. Flash ranging used similar principles but relied on visual observation. Observers at multiple positions would spot the muzzle flash from enemy guns. By triangulating these observations, they could plot the enemy battery location. Both systems worked best at night when sound carried farther and flashes were more visible. Both systems could provide targeting data to friendly artillery within 1 to 2 minutes of enemy guns firing. German artillery crews had no equivalent systems. German sound ranging equipment existed, but was less sophisticated and less widely deployed. German counter-battery procedures relied primarily on forward observers spotting enemy gun positions, a slower and less reliable method. German fire direction procedures, while effective, were not optimized for the kind of rapid response the Americans had institutionalized. The result was a fundamental mismatch in counter-battery capability. When German guns fired, American sound and flash ranging units detected them immediately. Within 60 seconds, target coordinates were being transmitted to American fire direction centers. Within another 60 seconds, firing data was being transmitted to batteries. Within another 60 to 90 seconds, American shells were in the air. Total time from German guns firing to American shells landing on that position, 3 to 4 minutes. German counter-battery procedures, by contrast, required forward observers to visually locate enemy guns, estimate their position, call back to fire direction centers using field telephones that were often disrupted by American artillery fire, wait for firing data to be calculated and transmitted, and then wait for German guns to lay on target and fire. The entire process rarely took less than 10 minutes and often took significantly longer. Weber, standing beside his howitzer on the morning of November 18th, 1944, understood none of this technical detail. He only knew that American counter-battery fire was fast, terrifyingly fast. Faster than anything German doctrine had prepared crews to face. His battery had fired its mission. His watch showed 2 minutes 30 seconds. The guns were attached to their transport vehicles. The prime movers were moving forward to connect the guns. In another 30 seconds, They would be pulling out of the firing position. Then he heard it. The sound was distinctive, a freight train roar growing louder, the sound of heavy shells passing overhead. But these shells were not passing overhead. They were incoming. The sound changed pitch as the shells descended. Weber's stomach clenched. He had heard that sound before in Russia, but never this quickly after his own battery had fired. The first American shells landed in a pattern across the battery position. The forward observer who had called this fire mission had done his job well. The sound ranging unit had provided accurate coordinates. The American Fire Direction Center had processed the mission with practiced efficiency. 3 batteries of howitzers had fired simultaneous volleys. 36 high explosive shells arrived within a 5-second span. Weber threw himself flat. The ground heaved. Explosions walked across the position, each shell creating a blast radius of approximately 30 meters within which fragmentation was lethal. The carefully selected firing position, which German doctrine said should be vacated within 5 to 7 minutes, was being saturated with high explosive before 3 minutes had elapsed. One of the 4 guns in Weber's battery took a direct hit. The shell struck the shield, penetrated, and detonated among the ready ammunition stored beside the gun. The howitzer disintegrated in a secondary explosion that threw fragments across the position. The crew, who had been preparing to mount the prime mover, were killed instantly. A second gun was caught by 3 shells landing within meters of each other. The overlapping blast fragmented the gun's trail, shredded the tires on its carriage, and killed or wounded the entire crew. The prime mover that had been approaching to hook up this gun was struck by shell fragments that punctured the engine block and killed the driver. The third gun's crew had managed to hook up their howitzer and were beginning to move when shells landed behind them. Fragments struck the half-track's rear compartment, killing 2 men riding in the back. The driver accelerated, pulling the gun away from the killing zone even as more shells landed around them. Weber's gun, the 4th in the battery, was already moving when the barrage began. His crew had mounted the prime mover seconds before the first shells landed. The driver, hearing the incoming rounds, accelerated without waiting for orders. The half-track pulled the howitzer out of the position at maximum speed, tracks throwing dirt, moving toward the pre-planned displacement route. Behind them, the battery position continued to receive fire. American artillery was not firing random harassing fire. This was a deliberate mission to destroy an identified target. The forward observer, watching through binoculars from his position with an American infantry company, could see the German firing position through breaks in the smoke. He adjusted fire, calling corrections. More shells arrived, walking across the position, ensuring total coverage. When the barrage lifted after approximately 2 minutes of sustained fire, the German battery position was a landscape of overlapping craters. 2 guns were destroyed beyond repair. Equipment was scattered across the area. Ammunition that had been prepared for the mission was detonated or buried under dirt thrown up by explosions. 7 men were dead, 5 were wounded, some critically. The battery, which had consisted of 4 guns and approximately 40 men, was combat ineffective. Weber's gun and 1 other escaped. They reached an alternate position 3 kilometers away and went into hiding. Guns concealed under camouflage nets. Crews waiting for orders that would not come until the shattered battery could be reconstituted with replacement guns and personnel. The entire engagement from the moment Weber's battery fired its mission to the moment his gun reached safety had lasted 7 minutes. American counter-battery fire had arrived in under 3 minutes. The battery had lost half its guns and nearly a quarter of its personnel. This was not an isolated incident. This was the pattern across the Western Front in the autumn and winter of 1944. German artillery batteries that fired missions found themselves under American counter-battery fire with a speed that German doctrine had never anticipated. Batteries that followed proper displacement procedures, moving within 5 to 7 minutes of firing, still took casualties. Batteries that delayed, that fired multiple missions from the same position, or that were slow to displace, were destroyed. German after-action reports from this period consistently noted the speed and accuracy of American artillery response. A report from the 716 Infantry Division in December 1944 stated that enemy artillery fire followed their own fire missions with a rapidity that suggested the enemy had prior knowledge of gun positions. Displacement within 5 minutes of firing was no longer sufficient to avoid casualties. Batteries were instructed to displace within 3 minutes when possible. But 3 minutes was barely enough time to attach a gun to its transport vehicle and begin moving, let alone reach a safe position. The mathematics of survival had changed. German artillery doctrine developed over years of combat experience was suddenly inadequate. The enemy's capability exceeded what German planners had believed possible. Individual German artillerymen, men like Weber who survived multiple fire missions, developed their own survival techniques. Some batteries began firing only single rounds before displacing, sacrificing effectiveness for survival. Others fired from positions with immediate cover available, natural depressions or tree lines that crews could reach within seconds. Some batteries ceased firing altogether during daylight hours, when American observation aircraft and forward observers had better visibility, conducting fire missions only at night when displacement in darkness offered some protection. These adaptations helped but could not eliminate the fundamental problem. American artillery could respond faster than German batteries could displace. The American system, built on abundant equipment, excellent communications, and doctrine that prioritized speed, had created a capability that German artillery could not match and could barely survive against. The psychological impact on German artillery crews was profound. Artillerymen had always faced danger, but traditionally from enemy counter-battery fire that arrived after they had displaced, or from air attack, or from enemy ground forces overrunning positions. The danger was manageable through proper tactics and alertness. But American counter-battery fire arrived so quickly that proper tactics were barely sufficient, and sometimes not sufficient at all. Crews developed fatalism. They knew that firing a mission meant accepting risk that displacement procedures might not eliminate. They fired because orders required it, because the infantry needed support, because their role in the German military was to provide artillery support regardless of cost. But they harbored no illusions about their chances if American sound-ranging units detected them. Captured German artillery officers, interrogated by American intelligence personnel, consistently expressed shock at American artillery capabilities. One battery commander captured in December 1944 near Aachen told interrogators they knew American artillery was numerous, but did not know it was so fast. German doctrine called for displacement within 5 minutes, but American counter-battery fire arrived in 3 minutes. The interrogator's report noted the subject appeared genuinely shaken by American artillery response times. This belief that Americans possessed some unknown detection technology was common among German troops. Some believed Americans had aircraft with special equipment that could see through camouflage. Others believed American artillery observers had electronic devices that detected gun flashes from extreme distances. The reality that American advantages came from sound-ranging equipment, efficient fire direction procedures, and abundant artillery was less exotic, but more devastating because it represented systematic superiority rather than a single technological secret that might be countered. The impact on German military effectiveness was substantial. Artillery is often called the king of battle, and with good reason. Artillery provides fire support for infantry attacks, breaks up enemy attacks, interdicts enemy movements, and destroys enemy fortifications. An army without effective artillery is severely handicapped. An army whose artillery cannot fire without suffering immediate counter-battery fire is in an impossible position. By late 1944, German artillery on the Western Front was increasingly ineffective. Batteries fired fewer missions, conserving ammunition and avoiding the risk of counter-battery fire. Fire support for German infantry attacks became spotty and inadequate. German defensive positions received less artillery support than doctrine called for. The German military, which had begun the war with excellent artillery and well-developed fire support doctrine, found itself increasingly unable to employ its artillery effectively. American infantry units reported that German artillery fire, while still dangerous when it came, was less frequent and less sustained than in earlier campaigns. The strategic implications were significant. Artillery had been central to German military success in the early war years. The careful coordination of artillery with armor and infantry, the blitzkrieg methodology, required effective artillery support. German defensive doctrine similarly relied on artillery to break up enemy attacks and inflict casualties on attacking forces. When German artillery became ineffective, the entire German tactical system suffered. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 illustrated these problems. The German offensive launched on December 16th initially achieved surprise and made significant gains. German artillery supported the attack with heavy fire missions using ammunition stockpiled specifically for this offensive. But as American forces recovered and counterattacked, American artillery dominated the battlefield. German batteries that fired in support of their infantry were quickly identified and destroyed by American counter-battery fire. Within days of the offensive start, German artillery commanders were reporting unsustainable losses. Batteries were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced or reconstituted. By early January 1945, when the German offensive was finally halted, German artillery units in the Bulge salient had suffered catastrophic casualties. One German artillery regiment that entered the offensive with 36 guns emerged with 11 guns still operational and barely half its personnel. The regiment's war diary, captured later by American forces, documented the progressive destruction of batteries throughout the offensive. Entry after entry recorded the same pattern. Battery fires mission. American counterfire arrives within 3 to 5 minutes. Battery suffers casualties. Surviving guns displaced to new position after the war. American and German military historians analyzed the artillery performance of both sides. The consensus was clear. American artillery had been systematically superior in every measurable category. American guns were at least as good as German guns technically. American ammunition was more plentiful and of consistent quality. American fire direction procedures were faster and more efficient. American forward observers were better trained and equipped. American counter-battery capabilities were vastly superior, but the most important factor was systematic. The American military had built an artillery system, a comprehensive approach that integrated equipment, training, doctrine, communications, and logistics into a coherent whole. German artillery, while technically proficient, operated within a system that was less integrated, less well supplied, and ultimately less effective. The 3-minute window, the time German crews had after firing before American counterfire arrived, became a symbol of this systematic disparity. It represented not a single technological advantage, but rather the cumulative effect of many American advantages. Sound-ranging equipment that detected firing within seconds, radio communications that transmitted targeting data without delay, fire direction centers that calculated firing solutions in under a minute, abundant ammunition that allowed immediate maximum fire, and guns positioned within range of every likely enemy artillery. Position. German veterans who survived the war and wrote memoirs or gave interviews consistently mentioned American artillery as one of the most devastating aspects of fighting on the Western Front. They described the psychological strain of knowing that any mission might be their last. They described the frustration of being unable to provide adequate support to their infantry because the risk of counter-battery fire was too high. They described watching experienced crews and valuable equipment destroyed in seconds by American fire that arrived impossibly fast. Klaus Weber survived the war. His battery was never reconstituted to full strength after the losses in November 1944. He served with understrength artillery units through the winter, firing occasional missions and experiencing several more instances of devastating American counterfire. In March 1945, his unit was overrun by American armor near Remagen. Weber was captured, spending the final months of the war in a prisoner of war camp. In interviews conducted decades later, Weber remembered the speed of American artillery as the defining characteristic of combat on the Western Front. In Russia, they had time. They could fire and move and be safe. Against the Americans, there was never enough time. They would fire, and before they could move, American shells were already falling. It was not a matter of courage or training. It was simply impossible. American artillery was faster than they could respond to. This testimony, echoed by hundreds of German veterans, confirms what the statistics and after-action reports demonstrate. American artillery in World War II achieved a level of systematic effectiveness that no other military matched. The speed of American counter-battery fire, arriving in 3 to 4 minutes from enemy guns firing, was not an accident or a lucky occurrence. It was the designed result of a military system built specifically to deliver rapid mass artillery fires. The lessons learned from this experience shaped post-war artillery development. The United States military codified the procedures that had worked so well, refining them further. Fire direction procedures became even more standardized. Communications equipment became more reliable and more portable. Sound and flash ranging equipment became more accurate. The doctrine of massed fires, rapid response, and abundant ammunition remained. Central to American artillery through subsequent conflicts. German military analysis after the war acknowledged that German artillery doctrine had been inadequate for the realities of combat against American forces. Post-war German military writing emphasized the importance of rapid displacement, the need for redundant communications, and the value of detection equipment for counter-battery work. But the fundamental lesson was one of industrial capacity. Germany had fought an enemy whose industrial production matched or exceeded German production. The result was inevitable. For the individual crews who served in German artillery batteries in 1944 and 45, the experience was one of progressive disillusionment. They had trained on equipment they believed was effective. They had learned tactics they believed were sound. They had entered combat with confidence in their abilities and their military. Then they encountered an enemy whose systematic advantages rendered German equipment and tactics inadequate. The 3 minutes they had after firing before American shells arrived became a countdown to survival. Some crews made it, many did not. The survivors remembered not the glory of battle, but the helpless frustration of being outmatched by an enemy whose advantages were not dramatic individual superiority, but systematic, industrial, comprehensive superiority across every aspect of artillery warfare. This was the reality of industrial war between modern nations in the mid-20th century. Victory went not to the most courageous troops or the most brilliant tactics, but to the nation that could build the most effective military system, supply it with abundant resources, and employ it with systematic efficiency. American artillery in World War II was a nearly perfect example of this principle in action. German artillery, for all its technical competence and crew proficiency, could not overcome the systematic disadvantages under which it operated. The story of German artillery crews counting down 3 minutes after firing, knowing American counter-battery fire was already on the way, is a story about the limits of courage and skill when facing systematic industrial superiority. It is a story about how wars between modern nations are decided not by individual soldiers, but by the systems those soldiers operate within. And it is a reminder that in industrial warfare, the factory is as important as the battlefield, and the logistics system is as decisive as the frontline tactics. The clock was their enemy. Every German artillery gunner on the Western Front in 1944 understood this brutal truth. Once their cannons roared, they had roughly 180 seconds before hell descended upon them. 180 seconds to disconnect the weapons, attach them to transport vehicles, and escape. 180 seconds before their position became a killing zone. This was the reality of industrial war between modern nations in the mid-20th century. Victory went not to the most courageous troops or the most brilliant tactics, but to the nation that could build the most effective military system, supply it with abundant resources, and employ it with systematic efficiency. American artillery in World War II was a nearly perfect example of this principle in action. German artillery, for all its technical competence and crew proficiency, could not overcome the systematic disadvantages under which it operated. The story of German artillery crews counting down 3 minutes after firing, knowing American counter-battery fire was already on the way, is a story about the limits of courage and skill when facing systematic industrial superiority. It is a story about how wars between modern nations are decided not by individual soldiers, but by the systems those soldiers operate within. And it is a reminder that in industrial warfare, the factory is as important as the battlefield, and the logistics system is as decisive as the frontline tactics. The human dimension of this artillery war extended beyond simple statistics of guns destroyed and casualties inflicted. Each battery was a community of men who lived, worked, and often died together. These crews developed bonds forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. In the German military tradition, artillery units maintained strong esprit de corps. Crews took pride in their technical proficiency, in their ability to deliver accurate fire under difficult conditions, in their discipline under fire. The introduction of American counter-battery capabilities that could strike within 3 minutes fundamentally disrupted not just German tactical operations, but the psychological foundation upon which German artillery crews operated. Soldiers can endure tremendous hardship and danger when they believe their training, equipment, and tactics give them a fighting chance. What broke the morale of many German artillery crews was not simply the danger itself, but the growing realization that no amount of skill or adherence to doctrine could guarantee survival. Training and experience, which had been protective factors on the Eastern Front, seemed to offer diminishing returns against American artillery. Veteran crews who had survived years of combat in Russia found themselves as vulnerable as inexperienced replacements. The careful study of ballistics, the precise calibration of sights, the ability to calculate firing solutions rapidly, all the technical skills that defined artillery expertise, mattered little when the primary challenge became simply surviving long enough to fire and escape. This psychological erosion manifested in various ways across German artillery units. Some crews became increasingly reluctant to fire missions, finding reasons to delay or question orders. Others developed superstitious behaviors, believing that certain procedures or rituals might protect them. Some men requested transfers to other branches, preferring the dangers of infantry combat, where at least their fate seemed more within their control. Battery commanders faced the difficult task of maintaining discipline and combat effectiveness among crews who understood with mathematical certainty that each fire mission carried a significant probability of death or injury. The American artillery system that created this situation was itself the product of institutional learning and adaptation. The United States military had not entered World War II with the artillery capabilities it possessed by 1944. The development of American artillery effectiveness was a process of continuous improvement driven by combat experience, technological innovation, and systematic analysis of what worked and what did not. Early American artillery operations in North Africa in 1942 and 43 had revealed deficiencies. Coordination between forward observers and fire direction centers was sometimes poor. Communication equipment proved inadequate in desert conditions. Some units lacked sufficient training in rapid fire direction procedures. The Germans, fighting in North Africa with experienced crews and proven equipment, often had the advantage in artillery exchanges. But the American military possessed an institutional capacity for learning and adaptation that proved decisive. After-action reports from North Africa were systematically analyzed. Deficiencies in training were identified and corrected. Equipment problems were reported back to manufacturers who made modifications. Doctrine was revised based on combat experience. By the time American forces landed in Sicily and then mainland Italy in 1943, artillery performance had improved significantly. The Italian campaign provided further opportunities for refinement. The mountainous terrain of Italy presented unique challenges for artillery operations. Forward observers had to learn to adjust fire on targets at different elevations. Fire direction centers had to account for the ballistic effects of firing across valleys or up steep slopes. American artillery units developed techniques for positioning guns to provide fire support in terrain that limited fields of fire and complicated logistics. But it was in France, following the Normandy invasion in June 1944, that American artillery reached its peak effectiveness. The battles in Normandy's hedgerow country had been brutal and costly, but they provided intensive combat experience for American artillery units. By the time American forces broke out from Normandy in August and began rapid advances across France, American artillery crews and forward observers had developed an intuitive understanding of their system's capabilities. The speed and coordination that characterized American artillery by late 1944 was the result of thousands of individual crews and forward observers and fire direction center personnel learning their jobs under combat conditions. Procedures that looked good on paper in training were tested in actual combat and either validated or modified. Equipment that worked adequately in training sometimes failed in combat and was improved. The American military's willingness to identify problems, analyze them systematically, and implement solutions created a cycle of continuous improvement. The logistics system supporting American artillery was itself a remarkable achievement. Keeping artillery units supplied with ammunition in the quantities American doctrine demanded required an enormous logistical infrastructure. Ammunition had to be manufactured in the United States, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, landed at French ports, moved by truck or rail to forward ammunition supply points, and then distributed to individual batteries. This logistics chain operated with a reliability that German forces could only envy. American trucks, particularly the legendary 2.5-ton truck known as the Deuce and a Half, moved supplies forward in a continuous stream. Even during periods of rapid advance when supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, American artillery rarely faced ammunition shortages. Batteries could fire missions knowing that resupply would arrive within hours or at most a day or two. The contrast with German logistics was stark. By late 1944, the German military was facing systemic logistics collapse. Fuel shortages limited vehicle movement. Allied air attacks disrupted rail transportation. Ammunition production could not keep pace with expenditure. German artillery batteries often operated under strict ammunition rationing, with battery commanders personally responsible for accounting for every round fired. This disparity in logistics reinforced the disparity in combat effectiveness. American batteries could fire missions liberally, using ammunition to solve tactical problems. German batteries had to carefully consider whether any given target justified the expenditure of scarce shells. The psychological effect on German gunners of knowing their ammunition was limited, while American gunners enjoyed. Virtually unlimited supplies added another dimension to German demoralization. The American gunners who delivered this devastating fire were themselves often unaware of the full extent of their effectiveness. They fired their missions as trained, following procedures, responding to fire requests from forward observers. The results of their fire, the German batteries destroyed, the casualties inflicted, were often invisible to them. They knew in abstract terms that they were effective, that their fire was achieving its intended purpose. But the human consequences, the crews annihilated in seconds, the wounded left amid the wreckage of their gun positions, remained abstract and distant. This emotional distance is characteristic of modern artillery warfare. The gunner who pulls the lanyard never sees the enemy he kills. The forward observer who calls the fire mission may observe the results through binoculars from a distance, but does not confront the individual human consequences of the explosions he directs. This separation of killer from killed, the mechanical, impersonal nature of artillery warfare, is both a practical necessity and a psychological shield.